All right, so we're going to read more chapters from Stuart Little. We're on chapter 3 on page 13. And the questions to look for are, number 1, every morning, what does Stuart do with George first thing? 2, how did Stuart turn on the bathroom light? And 3, how did Stuart turn on the water faucet? All right. So washing up. Stuart was an early riser. He was almost always the first person up in the morning. He liked the feeling of being the first one stirring. He enjoyed the quiet rooms with the books standing still in the shelves, the pale light coming in through the windows, and the fresh smell of the day. In winter time it could be quite dark when he climbed from his bed made out of the cigarette box. And he sometimes shivered with cold as he stood in the nightgown doing his exercise. Stuart touched his toes 10 times every morning to keep himself in good condition. He had seen his brother George do it, and George had explained to it that it kept his stomach muscles firm and was a fine abdominal thing to do. After exercising, Stuart would slip on his handsome wool wrapper, tie the cord tightly around his waist, and start for the bathroom, creeping silently through the long dark hall, past his mother's and father's room, past the hall closet where the carpet sweeper was kept, past George's room, and along by the head of the stairs till he got to the bathroom. Of course the bathroom would be dark too, but Stuart's father had thoughtfully tied a long string to the pull chain of the light. The string reached clear to the floor. By grasping it as high as he could and throwing his whole weight on it, Stuart was able to turn on the light, swinging on the string this way, with his long bathroom trailing around his ankles. He looked like a little old friar pulling on the bell rope in an abbey. See? Alright. To get to the wash basin, Stuart had to climb a tiny rope ladder which his father had fixed for him. George had promised to build Stuart a small special wash basin only 1 inch high and with a little rubber tube through which water would flow. But George was always saying that he was going to build something and then forgetting about it. Stuart just went ahead and climbed the rope ladder to the family wash basin every morning to wash his face and hands and brush his teeth. Mrs. Little had provided him with a doll's washcloth and a doll's comb. Which he used for combing his whiskers. He carried these things in the bathrobe pocket, in which he reached the top of the ladder. He took them out, laid them neatly in a row, and set about the tasks of turning the water on. For such a small fellow, turning the water on was quite a problem. He had discussed it with his father one day after making several unsuccessful attempts. "I can get up onto the faucet all right," he explained, "but I can't seem to turn it on, because I have nothing to brace my feet against." "Yes, I know," his father replied. "That's the whole trouble." George, who has always been listening to conversations whenever he could, said that in his opinion they ought to construct a brace for Stuart. And with that he got out some boards, a saw, a hammer, a screwdriver, a bradawl, and some nails, and started to make a terrific fuss in the bathroom, building what he had said was going to be a brace for Stuart. But as soon as he became interested in something else and disappeared, leaving the tools lying around in the bathroom floor. Stuart, after examining this mess, turned it to his father again. "Maybe I could pound the faucet with something and turn it on that way," he said. So Stuart's father provided him with a very small light hammer made of wood and Stuart found that by swinging it 3 times around his head and letting it come down with a crash against the handle of the faucet, he could start a thin stream of water flowing, enough to brush his teeth in, anyway, and moisten his washcloth. So every morning after climbing into the basin, he would seize his hammer and pound the faucet, and the other members of the household, dozing in their beds, would hear the bright, sharp plink, plink, plink of Stuart's hammer, like a faraway blacksmith, telling them that the day had come and that Stuart was trying to brush his teeth. All right, that's the chapter 3. And there's Stuart trying to turn on his water. All right. Chapter 4 is exercise. That starts on 17. And the questions you'll be looking for are 1. What did Stuart argue with the snowbell over? 2. What happened when he jumped on the window shade ring? And 3. What did Snowbell do? Alright. One fine morning in the month of May, when Stuart was 3 years old, he arose early as when his custom, washed and dressed himself, took his hat and cane, and went downstairs into the living room to see what was doing. Nobody was around but Snowbell, the white cat belonging to Mrs. Little. Snowbell was another early riser, and this morning he was lying on the rug in the middle of the room, thinking about the days when he was just a kitten. "Good morning," said Stuart. "Hello," replied Snowbell sharply. "You're up early, aren't you?" Stuart looked at his watch. "Yes," he said. "It was only 5 minutes past 6, but it felt good, and I thought I'd come down and get a little exercise." "I should think you'd get all the exercise you want up there in the bathroom, banging around, waking all the rest of us up trying to get that water started so you can brush your teeth. Your teeth aren't really big enough to brush anyways. Want to see a good set? Look at mine." Snowbell opened his mouth and showed 2 rows of gleaming white teeth, sharp as needles. "Very nice," said Stuart, "but mine are all right, too, even though they're small. As for exercise, I'd take all I can get. I bet my stomach muscles are firmer than yours." "I bet they're not," said the cat. "I bet they are," said Stuart. "They're like iron bands." "I bet they're not," said the cat. Stuart glanced around the room to see what he could do to prove to Snowbell what good stomach muscles he had. He spied the drawn window shade on the east window with its shade cord and ring, like a trapeze, and it gave him an idea. Climbing to the windowsill, he took off his hat and laid down his cane. "You can't do this," he said to the cat, and he ran and jumped onto the ring the way acrobats do it in the circus, meaning to pull himself up. A surprising thing happened. Stuart had taken such a hard jump that it started the shade. With a loud snap, the shade flew up clear to the top of the window, dragging Stuart along with it and rolling him up inside so that he couldn't budge. "Holy mackerel," said Snowball, who was almost as surprised as Stuart Little. "I guess that will teach him to show off his muscles." "Help! Let me out!" cried Stuart, who was frightened and bruised inside the rolled-up shade and who could hardly breathe. But his voice was so weak that nobody heard. Snowbell just chuckled. He was not fond of Stuart, and it didn't bother him at all that Stuart was all wrapped up in the window shade, crying and hurt and unable to get out. Instead of running upstairs and to tell Mr. and Mrs. Little about the accident, Snowbell did a very curious thing. He glanced around to see if anybody was looking, and then he leapt leaped softly to the windowsill, picked up Stuart's hat and cane in his mouth, carried them to the pantry, and laid them down on the entrance of the mouse hole. When Mrs. Little came down later and found them there, she gave a shrill scream, which brought everybody on the run. "It happened," she cried. "What has?" asked her husband. "Stuart's down the mouse hole." All right, that's the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5 is rescued. The questions you'll look for are, what did George want to do to find Stuart? 2, what did they end up doing? And 3, why did George pull down the shade? All right. Chapter 4 is rescued on page 21. George was in favor of ripping up the pantry floor. He ran down and got his hammer, his screwdriver, and an ice pick. I'll have this old floor up in double quick time," he said, inserting his screwdriver under the edge of the first board and giving a good, vigorous pry. "We will not rip up this floor until we have had a good search," announced Mr. Little. "That's final, George. You can put that hammer away where you got it." "Oh, all right," said George. "I see that nobody in this house cares anything about Stuart but me." Mrs. Little began to cry. "My poor dear little son," she said. "I know he'll get wedged somewhere. Just because you can't travel comfortably in a mouse hole doesn't mean that it isn't perfectly suitable place for Stuart," said Mr. Little. "Just don't get yourself all worked up." "Maybe we ought to lower some food to him," suggested George. "That's what the state police did when a man got stuck in the cave." George darted into the kitchen and came running back with a dish of applesauce. "We can pour some of this in, and it will run down to where he is." George spooned out a little bit of the applesauce and started to poke it in the hole. "Stop that," bellowed Mr. Little. George, will you kindly let me handle this situation? Put the applesauce away immediately." Mr. Little glared fiercely at George. "I was just trying to help my own brother," said George, shaking his head as he carried the sauce back to the kitchen. Let's all call the Stuart," suggested Mrs. Little. It is quite possible that the mouse hole branches and twists about, and that he has lost his ways." "Very well," said Mr. Little. "I will count 3, and then we will call. Then we will all keep perfectly quiet for 3 seconds, listening for an answer." He took out his watch. Mr. and Mrs. Little and George got down on their hands and knees and put their mouths as close as possible to the mouse hole. Then all called, "Stuart!" and then they all kept perfectly still for 3 seconds. Stuart, from his cramped position inside the rolled-up shade, heard them yelling in the pantry and called back, "Here I am!" But he had such a weak voice and was so far inside the shade that the other members of the family did not hear his answering cry. "Again," said Mr. Little. 1, 2, 3, Stuart! It was no use. No answer was heard. Mrs. Little went up to the bedroom, lay down, and sobbed. Mr. Little went to the telephone and called up to the Bureau of Missing Persons. But when the man asked for the description of Stuart and was told that he was only 2 inches high, he hung up in disgust. George, meantime, went down cellar and hunted around to see if he could find the other entrances to the mouse hole. He moved a great many trunks, suitcases, flower pots, baskets, boxes, and broken chairs from one end of the cellar to the other, in order to get at the section of the wall which he thought was likeless, but found no hole. He did, however, come across an old discharged rowing machine of Mr. Little's, and became interested in this, carried it upstairs with some difficulty, and spent the rest of the morning rowing. When lunchtime came, everybody had forgotten about breakfast. All three sat down to the lamb stew which Mrs. Little had prepared, but it was a sad meal, each one trying not to stare at the small empty chair which Stuart always occupied right next to Mrs. Little's glass of water. No one could eat, so great was the sorrow. George ate a bit of dessert, but nothing else. When lunch was over, Mrs. Little broke out crying again, and said she thought Stuart must be dead. "Nonsense, nonsense," growled Mr. Little. If he is dead," said George, "we ought to pull down the shade all through the houses." And he raced to the windows and began pulling down the shades. "George!" shouted Mr. Little in an exasperated tone. "If you don't stop acting in an idiotic fashion, I will have to punish you. We are having enough trouble today without having to cope with your foolishness." But George had already run into the living room and had begun to darken it, to show his respect for the dead. He pulled on the cord, and out dropped Stuart onto the window-sill. "Well, for the love of Pete," said George, "look who's here, Mom." "It's about time somebody pulled down that shade," remarked Stuart. "That's all I can say. He was quite weak and hungry." Mrs. Little was so overjoyed to see him that she kept right on crying. Of course, everybody wanted to know how it had happened. "It was simply an accident that might happen to anybody," said Stuart. "As for my hat and cane being found at the entrance of the mouse hole, you can draw your own conclusions." All right, that's the end of chapter 5.